If you're enjoying this tale from the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories of gunfighters, lawmen, and the untamed frontier. Now, let's dive into a story that'll shake you to your very core. The dust swirled through Tombstone's main street as Sheriff Marcus Kane stood on the wooden steps of his office, his weathered hands gripping the porch railing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the plaza where townsfolk had gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Kane's voice boomed across the square, carrying the weight of desperation and paternal fury. The sheriff's daughter, Elizabeth, watched from her bedroom window above the general store, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat belly. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that made grown men stumble over their words, with golden hair that caught sunlight like spun silk and eyes the color of prairie grass. But behind those eyes lay a secret that would shake the very foundations of her father's proclamation. 3 months earlier, Elizabeth had encountered the notorious gunslinger Jake Morrison at the town's harvest dance. Morrison was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, with coal-black hair and eyes that seemed to hold the depth of midnight. He'd ridden into Tombstone like a storm cloud, bringing with him a reputation for quick draws and quicker tempers. The townspeople whispered his name in hushed tones, counting the notches on his gun like rosary beads. That night at the dance, while couples swayed to the fiddle's melody, Elizabeth found herself drawn to the mysterious stranger who stood alone in the shadows. There was something magnetic about his presence, a dangerous allure that her sheltered life had never exposed her to. When he asked her to dance, she should have refused. When he led her outside into the moonlit garden, she should have returned to the safety of the crowd. But Elizabeth Kane was not one to follow the path others laid before her. She had inherited her father's stubborn streak and her late mother's fierce independence. As Jake's rough hands held hers beneath the stars, she felt alive in a way she'd never experienced. They talked through the night about dreams and disappointments, about the vast frontier that stretched beyond the town's borders, about the weight of expectations and the price of freedom. Jake Morrison was not the cold-blooded killer the stories painted him to be. Behind his hardened exterior lived a man haunted by choices he'd made and paths he couldn't retrace. He'd grown up an orphan, raised by the harsh realities of frontier life, where survival often came at the barrel of a gun. Each man he'd killed weighed heavy on his soul, but in a world where mercy was often mistaken for weakness, he'd learned to bury his conscience deep. Their clandestine meetings continued for weeks. Elizabeth would slip away from her father's watchful eye, meeting Jake at an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town. In those stolen moments, they created a world separate from the violence and judgment that surrounded them. Jake spoke of leaving his gunfighting days behind, of finding a place where his reputation wouldn't follow. Elizabeth dreamed of a life beyond the confines of being the sheriff's daughter, but secrets in small towns have a way of surfacing like bodies in a shallow grave. Word reached Sheriff Kane that his daughter had been seen in the company of the very man he'd been trying to run out of town. The confrontation that followed shattered the fragile peace Elizabeth had found. Her father's rage was biblical in its intensity, his disappointment cutting deeper than any blade. Kane's ultimatum was simple and brutal. Jake Morrison would leave Tombstone forever or face the sheriff's gun at dawn. Elizabeth pleaded with her father, tried to explain that Jake wasn't the monster everyone believed him to be. But Kane's mind was made up. He'd spent too many years building his reputation as an honest lawman to see it destroyed by his daughter's infatuation with an outlaw. Jake Morrison could have simply ridden away. His horse was saddled, his few possessions packed, but love, he discovered, was a more powerful force than self-preservation. The thought of leaving Elizabeth behind felt like death itself. Instead of fleeing, He made a choice that would seal both their fates. He stayed, knowing that doing so would force a confrontation he might not survive. The showdown came at high noon, with half the town gathered in the street to witness what many expected would be Jake Morrison's final moment. Sheriff Kane was no slouch with a gun himself, his years of keeping the peace having honed his skills to a razor's edge. The two men faced each other in the dusty street, hands hovering over their holsters, while Elizabeth watched in horror from her window above. What happened next would be debated in Tombstone saloons for years to come. Some said Jake Morrison's draw was faster than lightning itself. Others claimed Sheriff Kane hesitated at the crucial moment, perhaps seeing something in the young man's eyes that gave him pause. What everyone agreed on was the outcome. Marcus Kane lay dying in the dust, while Jake Morrison stood over him, smoking Colt still in his hand. Elizabeth rushed to her father's side as his life ebbed away. With his final breath, Kane whispered words that would haunt her forever. "I was trying to protect you, little bird. That man will bring you nothing but sorrow." As the sheriff's eyes closed for the last time, Elizabeth felt her world crumble around her. The man she loved had killed the only family she had left. The town's reaction was swift and merciless. A posse formed within hours, their intent clear. Jake Morrison would hang before sunset, but the gunslinger had vanished like smoke on the wind, leaving behind only questions and a grief-stricken young woman who now found herself truly alone. Some said they saw him riding north toward the mountains. Others swore he'd headed south for the Mexican border. Elizabeth's condition became apparent as the weeks passed. The town's judgment was harsh and unforgiving. Whispers followed her wherever she went, cruel speculation about the child she carried. The respectable families that had once welcomed the sheriff's daughter now crossed the street to avoid her. She found herself an outcast in the town where she'd been born and raised, carrying the seed of the man who had killed her father. Months passed with no word from Jake Morrison. Some believed he was dead, killed by bounty hunters or rival gunfighters. Others claimed he'd found sanctuary in the lawless territories beyond civilization's reach. Elizabeth held on to hope, like a drowning woman clutching driftwood, believing that somehow, someday, he would return to make things right. The baby was born on a cold winter night, delivered by the town's doctor, who performed his duty with professional detachment. As Elizabeth held her son for the first time, she saw Jake Morrison's dark eyes staring back at her. The child was beautiful and perfect, but his very existence served as a constant reminder of the tragedy that had torn her life apart. She named him Samuel, after her grandfather, hoping to give him a legacy unmarked by violence. Years passed, and the story of Sheriff Kane's death became legend. Traveling storytellers embellished the tale with each telling, transforming Jake Morrison from a man into a myth. Some portrayed him as a cold-blooded villain who seduced an innocent girl to strike at her father's heart. Others painted him as a tragic hero, a man destroyed by love and circumstances beyond his control. Elizabeth raised her son alone, working odd jobs to keep them fed and housed. The boy grew strong and quick, displaying an uncanny ability with firearms that worried his mother deeply. By the time Samuel reached his teens, his resemblance to his father was unmistakable. The townspeople watched him with a mixture of fascination and fear, wondering if the sins of the father would manifest in the son. On Samuel's 18th birthday, a stranger rode into Tombstone. He was older now, his black hair streaked with silver, his face lined by years of hard living. But Elizabeth recognized him immediately. Jake Morrison had returned, drawn back by a force he couldn't resist. The desire to see the son he'd never known and the woman he'd never stopped loving. Their reunion was bittersweet, filled with years of unspoken pain and regret. Jake had spent the intervening time trying to outrun his past, taking odd jobs in distant territories, always looking over his shoulder for the law or those seeking to claim the bounty on his head. But time had a way of healing some wounds while deepening others. The man who returned to Tombstone was changed, tempered by experience and loss. Samuel's reaction to meeting his father was complex and conflicted. Part of him had always wondered about the man whose actions had shaped his life before he was even born. Another part resented the stranger who had brought such pain to his mother and cast a shadow over his own existence. The young man possessed his father's quick temper and his grandfather's sense of justice, creating an internal conflict that threatened to tear him apart. The town's response to Jake Morrison's return was predictably hostile. Old wounds reopened, and calls for vigilante justice echoed through the streets. But Jake was no longer the same man who had faced Sheriff Kane in that dusty street years before. Age and experience had taught him the value of restraint, the wisdom that comes from understanding the true cost of violence. The confrontation that many expected never came. Instead, Jake Morrison did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He surrendered to the new sheriff, accepting responsibility for his past actions and agreeing to stand trial for Marcus Kane's death. It was a gesture that shocked the community and forced them to reconsider their preconceptions about the man they demonized for so long. Elizabeth visited him in jail, their conversations heavy with the weight of lost time and might-have-beens. They spoke of the paths not taken, the choices that had led them to this moment. Jake expressed his regret for the pain he'd caused, not just to Elizabeth, but to the entire community. He understood that his actions had consequences that rippled far beyond that fatal afternoon in the street. The trial became the most significant event in Tombstone's history. Witnesses testified about the events leading up to the shooting, painting a complex picture of a community torn apart by fear and misunderstanding. Some portrayed Jake Morrison as a villain who had corrupted an innocent girl. Others suggested that Sheriff Kane's own rigid thinking had contributed to the tragedy. Elizabeth's testimony proved to be the most compelling. She spoke with quiet dignity about her love for both men, her father who had tried to protect her and Jake who had tried to change for her. Her words painted a picture of two good men destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, trapped in roles that society had assigned them. Samuel listened to every word of the trial, struggling to understand the forces that had shaped his existence. He saw his father not as the mythical gunslinger of legend, but as a flawed human being who had made terrible mistakes while trying to find love and redemption. He saw his grandfather not as an infallible lawman, but as a man whose love for his daughter had blinded him to other possibilities. The jury's verdict surprised many. While they found Jake Morrison guilty of manslaughter, they recommended mercy, acknowledging the complex circumstances surrounding Sheriff Kane's death. The judge, moved by Elizabeth's testimony and the evidence of Jake's attempts at redemption, sentenced him to 10 years in prison rather than the hanging many had expected. As Jake Morrison was led away to serve his sentence, he looked back at Elizabeth and Samuel one last time. In that glance, he conveyed all the love and regret that words couldn't express. Elizabeth understood that this goodbye was final, that by the time he was released, if he survived prison at all, too much time would have passed for them to reclaim what they'd lost. Samuel struggled with his identity in the years that followed. He carried both his father's quick draw and his grandfather's sense of justice, two legacies that seemed incompatible. Some days he thought about following in Jake's footsteps, embracing the outlaw life that seemed to call to something deep in his blood. Other days he considered becoming a lawman like his grandfather, using his skills to protect rather than destroy. Elizabeth watched her son's internal struggle with growing concern. She had hoped that learning the truth about his father would bring him peace, but instead it seemed to intensify his confusion. The young man trained obsessively with his gun, as if preparing for a confrontation he couldn't yet name. His skill surpassed even his father's legendary ability, but Elizabeth feared where that path might lead. The decision came when Samuel turned 21. A group of cattle rustlers had been terrorizing the area around Tombstone, and the current sheriff seemed powerless to stop them. The young man made his choice, pinning on a deputy's badge and riding out to face the outlaws who had been plaguing the region. It was his way of honoring both legacies, using his father's skills in service of his grandfather's ideals. The confrontation with the rustlers tested every lesson Samuel had learned about violence and justice. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay dead, and the threat to the community was ended. But Samuel felt no satisfaction in the victory, only the familiar weight of violence that had shaped his family's story. He understood finally why his father had tried to leave the gun behind, and why his grandfather had carried the burden of keeping the peace. Elizabeth aged gracefully, her beauty evolving into the kind of dignity that comes from surviving great hardship. She became a pillar of the community, helping other women who found themselves in difficult circumstances. Her story served as both a cautionary tale and an example of redemption, showing that even the deepest wounds could heal with time and grace. News of Jake Morrison's death in prison reached Tombstone when Samuel was 25. He'd been killed in a fight with another inmate, dying far from the woman he'd loved and the son he'd barely known. Elizabeth mourned privately, remembering not the notorious gunfighter, but the gentle man she'd known in those stolen moments years before. Samuel inherited his father's guns and his holster, artifacts of a violent past that seemed to carry their own weight of destiny. He kept them locked away, understanding the temptation they represented and the path they could lead him down. Instead, he chose to honor both men's memories by becoming the kind of lawman his grandfather had aspired to be, one who understood that true justice required wisdom as well as courage. The years passed, and the legend of Sheriff Marcus Kane's challenge grew larger with each telling. Storytellers embellished the tale, adding details that never existed and motivations that simplified the complex reality. But those who had lived through the events remembered the truth, that good people could make terrible choices, that love could lead to tragedy, and that redemption was possible even in the darkest circumstances. Elizabeth lived to see her grandchildren born, watch Samuel marry a good woman, and build a life founded on different principles than those that had shaped his parents' story. She saw him become sheriff, following in his grandfather's footsteps, but with a wisdom that came from understanding the cost of rigid thinking and quick judgments. The old-timers who remembered Sheriff Kane's proclamation that day in the plaza often wondered what would have happened if things had gone differently. What if Kane had tried to understand rather than condemn? What if Jake had chosen to leave rather than fight? What if Elizabeth had defied them both and run away? But such questions had no answers, only the reminder that life rarely unfolds according to our expectations or desires. Samuel's children grew up knowing their family's history, understanding the complex legacy they inherited. They learned that heroes and villains were often the same people viewed from different angles, that justice was more complicated than the simple tales suggested, and that the choices of one generation echoed through the lives of those who followed. The guns that had killed Sheriff Marcus Kane eventually found their way to a museum, displayed as artifacts of a violent era that the civilized world was eager to leave behind. Visitors read the placard that told a simplified version of the story, but few understood the human complexity behind the legendary confrontation. They saw only symbols of a bygone age, not the real people whose lives had been forever changed by a moment of violence in a dusty street. Elizabeth's grave in Tombstone Cemetery bears a simple inscription: "Beloved mother and friend, she found forgiveness where others saw only blame." Next to it lies Sheriff Marcus Kane's weathered headstone, its words worn smooth by decades of desert wind. Jake Morrison lies buried in an unmarked grave in a prison cemetery, far from the town where his story began and ended. What do you think Samuel should have done with his father's guns when he inherited them? Should he have destroyed them, kept them as a reminder, or passed them on to the next generation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know what choice you would have made in his position.